Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm thrilled to welcome Steven Cohen to the podcast. David is an Emmy Award-winning writer, lyricist, and composer, whose credits include Pee-wee's Playhouse, Alf, Tiny Toon Adventures, Parker Lewis Can't Lose, Balto, Courage the Cowardly Dog, and many others. Welcome, David.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Very excited to have you on. So just to jump right in, my first question for you is, when did you know you wanted to pursue a career in writing, and how did you go about pursuing it?
I probably started thinking about a career in writing before I could write. I always liked telling stories, and I would make up stories and draw all over the wall to illustrate the stories. And my mother, and I was like standing up in my crib when I did this, and my mom, rather than scolding me, put up erasable paper on the wall so that I could draw all I wanted and make up all the stories I wanted. It was kind of like cave paintings at the time. And all through school, I really loved writing, and teachers responded well to it, my writing, so I kept doing it. But when I went to college, I knew I was attracted to the entertainment business, and I really didn't know exactly what aspect of it I wanted to go into, because I loved songwriting, I loved writing, I loved performing, whatever. So I majored in psychology because that would help no matter what. And, I sort of found my way into writing. It was sort of a natural evolution professionally, And then I started working with a pal of mine from college, and that's when we sort of like broke into the big leagues of writing. So it was kind of an evolution. I still haven't decided that my career is that of a writer, even though it's pretty well established. But, it's a really, writing and storytelling, I'm sort of holding as equivalent for the moment, so that I always loved that process. And the first time I remember wanting a specific job as a writer was on Letterman, early in his late night run. That was the show I just wanted more than anything. I just had lunch yesterday with a friend of mine who's a 25-year veteran of Letterman. He got the job that I never got, but if it had to go to somebody, I'm glad it was him. And I wound up on my career path when Roger, my former writing partner, who I knew from college, interviewed Steve Martin he was a journalist for a few years, and he interviewed Steve Martin about his art collection to do a profile for Connoisseur magazine. And he found out that Steve was producing a television show, and then at the end kind of broke protocol after a week with Steve and asked if he and his partner, me, could pitch something. Now, it was never my intention to get into the sitcom business, but getting into the Steve Martin business, well, who wouldn't want to?
Right.
So, and that was a half-hour comedy anthology, and it contained the first bit of animation that I ever wrote, even though it was live action. So it was kind of a natural flow, and then I found myself working in sitcoms in Hollywood, so that was kind of the evolution. And my storytelling has become, I've realized more and more as I progress through my career, how my storytelling has developed, how my techniques for getting at story, and my belief in, characters being the progenitors of story comes from character, all of that, it developed over the course of working on sitcoms and cartoons and operas and musical stuff. So it's an ongoing metamorphosis and evolution, but the beginnings were kind of, I would stay homesick from school a little longer than the sickness would last, so that I could make up stories. And I even had actually, maybe I was predestined, because I did dream about writing. I would dream episodes of the Dick Van Dyke Show as a child.
Oh, wow.
And I remember one in particular, and I was like 7 or 8, and in it was daylight savings time, or the other way around, I forget, but the clocks were being set ahead or back, and Richie set the clock, reset the clock, Laura reset the clock, and Rob reset the clock. And so Rob shows up to work, and it's dark out. And that was my dream, you know.
Wow,
And then I woke up from it and got like, oh, that was that on an episode? And I think back on it and I think, you know, somebody's had to have pitched that idea for an episode of something somewhere.
Right? Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I did grow up on a diet of sitcoms, and I did have a lot of respect for particularly the sitcoms of the 70s, like All in the Family and Mary Tyler Moore, and I got to work with people, you know, who worked on those. So that was a nice kind of link to my roots in a way. So short story long, I hope that answers the question, at least in part.
Definitely. That's so cool that you were already dreaming about stories. That's just really awesome too.
Yeah, I had a very creative childhood between the schools I went to and the teachers I had, the friends I had, and God bless it, my parents. You know, there was no artistic endeavor my brother or I could pursue without my parents gifting us with something they couldn't afford in order to pursue the art, whether it was painting or playing an instrument, or just a very musical and artistic family. So, you know, that's really where a lot of it comes from, I think, is, you know, your childhood. So it's interesting to talk to somebody who watched my stuff as a child.
Yeah.
You know, and here
Very
you are.
true.
So, you know, paying it forward, you know, and I look forward to you hiring me one day.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness. Yes. Dream come true for sure. Someday, can only dream. So I know also you have experience writing features, and that your first feature was writing Balto for Steven Spielberg. How did that opportunity come about?
Well, as with most things, you never know what effect your current work is going to have on your future and how it will have that effect. Generally, you work on something and it moves you on to the next thing that you're working on. But when we wrote that half hour for Steve Martin's show, this was called George Burns Comedy Week, half-hour comedy anthology. You know, it was the story of a guy who didn't want to be known as Mr. Honey Bunny, the creator of these cute and cuddly creatures, and he wanted to be a serious playwright, so he's at war with himself over this. And I'm sorry, it was just tell me the question again, because I when I start talking about that episode, it launches me in another direction.
No worries. Just basically what led to the experience that got you to write the feature for Steven Spielberg. Balto.
Right. Yeah. Because it was that script. That's the point. We wrote that script, and a lovely fellow, Doug Wood, read it at the time and said, "Wow, this is really good. There's a little bit of animation in here. He kills the honey bunnies. This is so, you know, this is dark, but it's smart." And he said, "One day I'm going to work with these guys." I don't know where he was working at the time, but 5 full years later, he was at Amblin. And while Spielberg was off directing Schindler's List, the script for Balto came in, not ours, but they wanted a new writer on it. The story would be essentially the same, but they really wanted the script, you know, brought more to life. I don't know exactly what the notes were on it. So Roger and I were hired to do the rewrite. We were working on Parker Lewis at the time, so we didn't tell anybody, because you don't want to spook your employer by saying, "And I'm doing a movie for Steven Spielberg." So it was sitting in Doug's drawer for 5 years. It was on his mind. And finally, this project came along, and you get the call, "Would you like to do a rewrite of an animated feature, executive producer Steven Spielberg?" And you say yes.
Of course, yeah.
Because you can't even say no. I can't even say no anywhere near the thought. So I've had for someone with the middle name Steven, I've had very good Steven luck with Steve Martin and Steven Spielberg.
That's so
where,
funny.
you know, when you start, like, your first job in TV is with Steve Martin, and your first movie is with Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
You then, you know, nowhere to go but down. So,
my God.
it kind of takes the pressure off
Crazy.
in a way. So that's it's actually a sort of a word of advice as well as the story. You know, don't, like, if you do something, whether it's on spec or for something you're hired for, and you send it around, don't get downhearted if you don't get a response
Right
immediately.
away.
It took 5 years for Doug Wood to find, and Doug was such a great executive. I knew he was the best executive I'd ever worked with, and he made sure that we got credit on the movie because it wasn't covered by the Writers Guild, so it didn't have an automatic arbitration for all the writers who worked on it.
Okay.
So Doug went through the script and highlighted all the lines that we contributed. So we wound up getting sharing screen credit with the original screenwriters. And I took my 5-year-old son to see it. He was like almost just about 0.3 years old when I started working on it. And cut to us at the New York premiere, and Kevin Bacon and Bridget Fonda and I and my son Julian stand up to take a bow because they introduced the people from the movie who showed up to the New York premiere. So I was 1 degree of Kevin Bacon immediately. But the job came to us because we had done good work at some point, and Doug was I was saying, he's such a good executive, he's now a writer, a very successful animation writer. So many of the executives I've met who I thought were just great, really understood the writing process, did, and became writers. Which is fortunate and unfortunate because you want more executives who really do understand the writing process. But that's how it happened, and we wound up sneaking this in, and in between the cracks. And I remember, I'll just quickly tell the story. I remember sitting in a meeting at Parker Lewis with the entire staff, and we were watching dailies because it was shot on single camera film over the course of a week, like a little movie. So we were watching the dailies from that day's shooting. And I was sitting near the door, and our assistant, Roger, my assistant, comes, knocks on the door, and hands me a folded piece of paper as a message. And I open it, and it says, "Spielberg loves your first draft."
Wow.
And my eyes shot out of my head. Roger is on the other side of the room, and the executive producer and creator of Parker Lewis, Clyde Phillips, wonderful guy, says, "Share with the class." and I look at this note and I say, I got to tell Roger immediately because I'm going to explode if I don't. But I got to figure out how to lie because clearly I saw something like, it either says, "I'm pregnant, you won $1 million," or "Spielberg loved your first draft."
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me that if I just said what was on the paper in front of me, I'd be telling the truth and people would think it was a joke. So I said out loud, "It says Spielberg loves our first draft, Roger." And everyone laughs. Roger turns whiter than white, and as I recall it.
Wow.
And I only and I said afterwards, nobody would believe it, right? So it was the best lie I could tell. Anything else would have sounded like the truth. And I did fess up to Clyde, the executive producer, at the wrap party for the final season, only after asking him if he thought that Roger and I did a perfect, exemplary job. And he loved us, so then I told him about having been working on this thing in between the cracks for Spielberg, and he said, "Fuck you, that's amazing, congratulations," and "fuck you."
Yeah.
Or something like that. But it was really wonderful. It was so much multitasking, but it was easier with a partner. So that's how that happened, and I haven't had a produced movie since then, so you think, okay, I'm doing a movie for Steven Spielberg, but I didn't pursue it heavily. I just thought that, as with my first job, with Steve Martin, which then led to my first sitcom staff job, an episode of that show that spun off into into a series of its own, we were hired for. So it's like this trajectory, this like momentum that you build, and you just sort of find yourself moving forward. And you don't ask questions when they're paying you that much money. It was just more money than you've ever gotten in your life, and it's very seductive. But when I think back, we worked on a lot of really interesting projects, and had I gotten a job on Letterman early on, I don't know if I'd have been able to even hold that job. But I like where we went. like the things that we did because they weren't the things that I would have picked, and then we sort of got to be able to pick a little bit, and we turned down jobs on hit sitcoms in order to write on cooler shows. So it was fun because no matter what choice we made, we were making a lot of money, and we had a really good manager who was shaping our career and making sure we didn't get stuck somewhere where nobody would see us for a year. And we'd fall off the radar. We'd make $1 million, but we'd fall off the radar. He didn't want that. He said, make $50, but stay on the radar. And he was very right about that.
Nice. So perseverance pays off, obviously.
Perseverance and having a partner is a great way to just to survive. And having really good representation. I envy my early representation. I envy myself my early representation. And also, there's a lot to work with when you're in your 20s and your career is just starting. Everybody wants you, so it had that going for it.
Nice. Okay, so obviously I want to talk about Courage the Cowardly Dog.
Sure.
So I'm curious to know how you became involved with the show and as the head writer.
Well, I had been the executive producer of a series called The Webulous World of Dr. Seuss for Nickelodeon. It's a series of half-hour musicals in the Seuss style, with Henson Muppet style Seuss characters, some new characters, some existing characters, but new stories and songs. It was really a great experience. One of the writers who did a couple of scripts for us knew John Dilworth, or his sister was working with John Dilworth, who created Courage. There had been an Oscar-nominated short that John made called The Chicken from Outer Space, and that introduced Courage as we know him. And that was the de facto pilot for a series. So there were a couple of episodes in terms of like writing or conjuring stories when I was hired. I was recommended by somebody who had the respect of John and of me. So it was a mutually it was a good recommendation. And his sister was I forget her role on the show, but she was like a close second to John in terms of sort of managing things. And I remember I was just thinking about it the other day. I remember that first meeting really, really well. And I wound up staying with the show for all 4 seasons. And then, it was the longest I'd ever stayed on one job, which is really interesting. But that was, again, and this was not anything that a representative brought me. This was something that a friend recommended me for, so it was kind of a natural, what's the Jewish word, the shidduch, a matchmaking.
Nice.
So that's, so it was interesting. I think we had a little dance at the beginning, just sort of like, is this going to work? Is this going to last? But man, it was so much fun working on that show.
Nice, yeah. And
challenging but fun.
Yeah, and then it's its 20th anniversary this year, and it's still so beloved, that show. And so I'm curious to know, since that show, there's so much horror and sci-fi themes, were you always interested in those types of genres?
Yes. I remember storytelling. I remember making up a lot of stories around Halloween time and forcing puppet shows on my friends. The other 7 and 8-year-olds really didn't have much patience for my puppet shows. I was always a fan of the genre and always kind of scared by horror films, but I was still a big fan. I was never I'll be honest, I was never a fan of Scooby-Doo, which didn't match up with my childhood exactly, so I didn't really have a way in. But in terms of like science fiction and science fiction parody, one of my favorite theatrical experiences was in high school, and this dates me, but I it's just because my girlfriend was on the school newspaper, as was I, and she was doing she did theater reviews. We wound up seeing the Rocky Horror Show before anybody knew what it was. We were the ultimate virgins, as they say. It was on Broadway for like a few weeks, and that's it. And it was Tim Curry and Meatloaf,
nice.
And maybe Richard O'Brien was in it too, because he was the writer, and Riff Raff in the movie. And they were making the movie about the same time as well. So the show closed, so the movie came out. We're sitting there in this cabaret setting, and Tim Curry's high kicking over our heads, and we didn't even know who he was. We said, "This is amazing." You know, you can't go see that for the first time anymore. You know too much about it. So we got to see it for the first time, and without any foreknowledge, and we were blown away. And that kind of made me think, wow, you can camp up horror and science fiction and present it in a different way that's kind of subversive, psychedelic. So that had a delayed effect on me. It stuck with me then, but it manifests later in my career. And I got to work with Richard O'Brien actually on a little pilot presentation that was a horror comedy. We hired him as an actor to play an actual dead body that's alive, because he's so gaunt, and we had written it to be sort of an American comic style comedian, but he brought his British kind of delicacy to it, and it was wonderful working with him. That was really kind of a coming full circle experience. If the pilot had become a series, it would have been a total blast. But as most things go, well, at least we got to make a pilot presentation. But yeah, I've always loved horror, and I've always loved being scared up to a point, and as a kid, being scared by a movie. So I was a fan, but it was never something like I was saying, this is what I want to do. It's one of the many things that engages me in terms of storytelling and styles of storytelling genre. Those signpost moments in my life that pointed me towards the darkness, and maybe a lot of them were just, what was going on in my head as a child too, whatever twisted, horrors I had, as a young courage kind of kid.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm really interested in hearing about your typical writing process, how you break a story for an episode, whether of Courage or just any show you've worked on.
Sure. I was just discussing yesterday with my former Letterman writer friend, sort of how people go about, because he's getting into writing longer form stuff now. And we were discussing sort of approaches to it. And really, story development has a lot to do with the schedule you're on. If I was writing a movie, I have a bit more time to fully flesh out a story. And I believe in outlining, especially when you're new to a certain genre or platform or whatever. Important to, I think, people sink themselves into scripts too soon. And certainly with Courage, I'm looking at that as an example of a typical television show. And most television shows will work this way. We're on a conveyor belt. We have to meet a deadline. And we're getting notes, and we got to change things and all of that. But we have to, keep the machine going, and it, the script is step one. So I would make sure. And Cartoon Network was very cooperative. They really didn't hamper us. They gave us a lot of room to work, and I can't be more grateful. But as far as the story process for that, we had a revolving door of freelancers, and they would come in, and we had a couple of people, who were associated with the show, who were sort of sat around the writer's table. So we had kind of this ad hoc writer's room, and I would diligently work a story with the writer of the moment, or if I was writing it myself, I would do it the same way with the people at the table. We would take an idea that had been approved. Generally, John would come up with the ideas, which were small inspirations, sometimes larger, but they needed to be turned into stories. So over the course of like 2 hours, or maybe sometimes 3, we would sit and break the story, and the writer would leave basically with what some would consider to be an outline. I would call it a beat sheet, because it was just, I'd make sure that up on the board, on the whiteboard, there was, here are all your beats. Now go and write an outline, but let's not diverge too much from this, because this is going to work. So the process was front loaded, because if we didn't do that, and the story started to meander, and if we went too quickly to a script, and we were trying to fix things later, it's like trying to build a house from the top down, and no matter what you do, it's never going to have structural integrity. So it really worked, and it gave us more of a chance to make a good or great episode, even better. Because when you're sort of flailing and trying to fix the story after you've gotten to the script, then it generally doesn't improve. It's interesting because different people have different working styles, so you have to be somewhat flexible. But as a head writer, working, and we had to double the scale. We had to do 2 episodes a week during one season. It was crazy. So it was even more important to get everybody sort of locked in. And that would give the writers a lot of freedom, just because I think writers, like for me anyway, I like a structure that I can then sort of build from and flesh out and find ways to make the story breathe a bit more. And it's a gestation process, and you really have to start with the DNA, and you have to make sure that it's right, because if you don't, then you're going to come out with something that might really need some help later on. And there are episodes I've written, of different shows where I just like sat down and just like had to get a script written. My outline was 3 sentences long, and I slammed through it, but it was a different kind of, it was a sort of a chaptered story. It wasn't a story with a huge arc, it was sort of sequential, and it lent itself to that kind of writing. So I like to float, I like to be adrift in the creative zone for a period of time, but before too long, there has to be something solid in front of me, whether I'm writing it, certainly if I'm writing it, but double certainly if I'm running the writing on a show and I know that we have to get that script delivered in 3 weeks and we're outlining it. The real trouble starts when you get notes on scripts that you should have gotten on outlines. And that's where I try to get executives to understand, or whoever's giving notes to understand that it doesn't help to take things apart later in the game. Take them apart at the beginning, put them back together, take them apart, put them back together. But by this day, we have to have an outline, or we're going to blow the schedule, and then I'll get blamed. The writing will get blamed. It's happened. I worked on a show where the technology was crashing all the time, but they blamed the scripts for this. It's because it's like it's always, because it is usually when production slows down, it's because it's not being fed. We're shoveling, the scripts are the coal being shoveled into the furnace, which is not a kind way to talk about scripts, but they do fuel the show.
Nice, yeah. So I'm also curious to hear about your personal favorite episodes that you've written.
Oh gosh, of Courage or
yeah, I guess of anything really. Any standouts to you personally?
Well, the episode for Courage, it's really hard to pick a favorite episode. What comes to mind. I mean, there are certain episodes that I like to use as samples to sort of describe what I did on the show, or, whether I'm showing it to somebody in order to find work, or just showing it to say this is what the show was. Courage in the Big Stinkin' City comes to mind. So many of the episodes were kind of movie parody, if not a specific film, but they were cinematic, and John Dilworth is a brilliant visualizer, and I mean his palette was gorgeous, and he really could work cinematically, and it's not a surprise that his first Courage episode was Oscar nominated. And Courage in the Big Stinkin' City felt that way. In fact, I think the opening credits were actually up on a marquee, and I loved it because it was just it took place in New York City and Radio City Music Hall. It was a ridiculous premise, but it had one of my favorite villains to write was Schwick, the cockroach. Bushwick, but you can call me Schwick. Don't ever call me Bushwick. And just writing this character who just had, it was fun coming up with sort of like finding the voice of the villain of the week. Freaky Fred certainly was the verse, and ending with naughty.
Yes.
And that is a favorite of mine, and certainly the Freaky Fred reanimated effort that went on that just blew my mind. We're 120 animators, more than 120 animators, each animated a different shot, reanimated a different shot in different style, and I know you've seen it, but it's wild 20 years later to see your stuff reinvented. You know, there's the original audio track, and there's essentially the same cartoon, but a different style with every shot. Mind blowing. And Little Muriel, I love the more macaroni, less macaroni,
Yes, yeah.
more cheese. I hate macaroni and cheese. You know, there are certain times you're writing something and you just know what you know, and you hear it and it's what you wrote. There are a lot of times you write something and you hear it and it's not at all what you wrote. And most of the time you hear it and you go, oh, all right, that's not what I heard exactly, but I like this performance, you know, and this is what this performer did with it. But most rewarding is when, like, you hear it in your head and you communicate it on the page through whatever means, you know, using spaces or ellipses or whatever, with minimal direction. You know, you don't want to do a lot of parentheticals. I use punctuation to cue actors to, you know, this is how I want the character to sound. It's funny, just for years I would, you know, go to the William Shatner voice as sort of an example of, you know, that kind of delivery. And I, 2 years ago, got the chance to work with William Shatner and write something that he actually performed, which was kind of a dream come true.
Wow.
To hear the man himself deliver my words. But I'm sure, you know, I could come up with, I like the Uncommon Cold because it was so weird. It was a later episode where Muriel gets this cold and then she sneezes this snot bubble, and inside of it is this slug from down south who's saying, you know, we sent you these germs to get you to come down here and save us because we're enslaved by this snake. I like the episodes that got them off the farm a lot. You know, those were a lot of fun to imagine, you know, different scenarios. So those are some of my favorites, but I you know, I'm sure that there are, I mean, I didn't write it, but I worked on it as head writer, the Return the Slab episode with King Ramses. You know, always a favorite, written by my friend Bill Marsili, with whom I wrote Freaky Fred. And also I love the Doc Gerbil episode. It's Doc Gerbil's World.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It was just so strange, and Jody Gray, who was the music director for the show, and with Andy Ezrin wrote the score for the episodes, and Jody and I are still friends and collaborators. We write a lot of songs together, and he scored this motorboat chase scene with like lush classical music, and it was just sort of, you'd think, antithetical to the movement of the moment, but it played so exquisitely. It created a tension with the visual that you don't often see in a cartoon. And Jody he really helped the storytelling with the score. I mean, we met like a year into the show. We'd been working together, but the conveyor belt nature of writing kids animation or that kind of show, it's like he's at the end of the conveyor belt and I'm at the beginning. And we met at like the first season rap party, and we've been writing songs together all year. You know, a couple of songs. You know, it wasn't a musical show. And look, there are a ton of other episodes of other shows I've written that I love. My Philosophy episode of Arthur, starring Neil Gaiman, is a real favorite, largely because it stars Neil Gaiman, and he dug the script and blogged about it. I didn't know he blogged about it till years later when I read. So, like, just praising it, and you know, he changed up a lot of his dialogue, but I'm fine with that. Neil Gaiman can rewrite me, and he's a charming guy. I got to meet him a few times, you know, as colleagues. How lovely! So, episodes can be your favorite for a lot of reasons, but that was, as with other of my Arthur episodes, pretty psychedelic, pretty weird. You know, Neil Gaiman showing up in your falafel is not something that happens generally. And this other episode of Arthur that I wrote called Binky's Music Madness, from which grew a meme called Binky Listens, and it was just a real trippy episode in which Binky was at odds with this sort of aggressively modern music and found sounds, and in order to prove that this music was awful, he did one of these things himself. But you know what? It was pretty good. He worked on it for several days, and by the end of it, he realized that it doesn't suck. And it was sort of reflective of my childhood. I use a lot of my own experiences and the experiences of my sons. That's another reason episodes will become favorites of mine, is because embedded in that episode is the thing my son did with in Little League. And this is when I remember when Julian bought his first comic book. So I put that into an Arthur episode as a little vignette, kind of little fun things that make moments sort of favorites for me. But I could go through every series I worked on and come up with favorite episodes, but those are the ones that come to mind at the moment.
Nice, that's awesome. Okay, so also, were you always conscious of finding the right balance between horror, humor, and heart when planning stories for Courage, or did that all come together organically when you wrote the scripts?
Well, it was first a matter of tuning into the frequency of the show. The show had a strong personality. Dilworth created something that was unique and straightforward and construct and already had a tone that I embraced. One of the things as a writer you tend to do is going from job to job. You don't necessarily define what the shows are. You have to embrace what the shows are, which is a good exercise in and of itself. So I gave myself to sort of the tone that was already Courage. Then in writing the shows, it's sort of like setting your dials to the right places. It made it easier to deliver the show. And then as we progressed, finding the right tone. And there were some episodes that were, more sentimental. There were episodes that were more action, but still, every time I would ask myself, how is Courage driving this episode? How are his fears and same for Muriel and all the other characters, but the show was a strong enough template, that it made it relatively easy to come up with the right balance. And after a while, it became impossible to not, because you would automatically know that this is, you have to tell a story dramatically. And I always wanted the story to work dramatically, even if it were like a straight up horror film, 11-minute horror film with no comedy, I'd want it to work. But for Courage, his fear at every moment was always played funny, and everything was, the characters were so weird, coming up with, you find it as you go. And it's an interesting question, because I never really, I never broke it down for myself. It just, some shows are harder to capture. They don't necessarily have such a clear self-definition. And some writers, would write scripts that were a lot funnier than other writers. And that's okay. Not every writer has every strength. So I might punch it up with jokes, or I might say, no, this is an episode that needs to be a little more sentimental, a little more serious. There were a couple of episodes that John really did on his own that were very cinematic and expansive and lighter on the comedy in a lot of cases. But it's sort of something that you would you work a little harder at first, and then sort of becomes part of the DNA of the job.
Gotcha. That's awesome. And you touched on this already, kind of, but another question I had was there anything that you wanted to write, but that was maybe deemed too dark by Cartoon Network? Yeah.
They let us write the Freaky Fred episode, and that was, even though it was like one of the few human villains, it was very creepy. But the network didn't interfere a lot, but we did get notes, and this is true. We had a room number. Courage was going just into some hell room. We had to open a door, and it was the address was 666, as written in the script. The devil's number, right? So they said it couldn't be 666 because it's too. That was an unusual note, because we didn't get a lot of that, but it wasn't a creative note that was like standards and practices. That was like, they vet that for things that really would be objectionable. That's not a creative note more than a kind of a strategic one in terms of who your audience is. So I just added a half to it, so it just was 666 and a half,
Oh,
and it was fine.
that's funny.
And it was one of those things where a note that you kind of felt was shame. It made it even funnier because everybody was in 666 and a half. That's like even worse than 666, right? Yeah, that's what it was. What it really was
Right.
a last minute fix because it was like, okay, this script has to get done, and this note just came in, and they said it was fine, but they didn't give us a lot. Linda Semensky was the head of the network at the time. She's now head or even above the head of PBS Kids, but she gives, or at least at that time, at Cartoon Network, gave the creators of the show, the creatives involved in the show, a lot of room or a lot of rope. It's like, it's rare that you find an executive who will say, I don't want to cramp your style. I don't want to impose my vision on you. I want you to do the best job you can do within reason and see if we got something. What a unique idea. Let creatives, and I'm not saying run roughshod over, it's like, yeah, I'll just do what I want, but there's a lot of nervousness in a business where if your job is giving notes, as mine often is, if you don't give notes, or if you give light notes, you might be called into question by your superiors. My ambition is, when I give notes, is that I'm giving notes on something that's so strong already, a wonderful script, that all I'm doing is saying, hey, here's an opportunity for a joke over there. What if we, then it's sort of a collaboration with the writer, and how to like just tweak it a little bit. So, no, I mean, most of my notes came from John Dilworth, because he was the one I dealt with most. And yeah, we got some notes, but they weren't. It was notably freeing, a freeing experience for me, and in terms of having room to tell stories and scare kids. I mean, that's another thing about the show was, 5-year-olds were watching it, and I wasn't so sure that 5-year-olds, some of the episodes were really dark, and some were a little frothier, but by and large, the reaction I see now, and God knows through social media and through this Freaky Fred Reanimated post where thousands of fans have weighed in, and wow, they did watch it when they were 5, and they're happy about it. They feel, so I learned how to deal with a very difficult childhood because Courage was dealing with the same kind of thing. The monsters in my world. And wow, I wasn't thinking hard about it at the time. All I knew was that I wanted Courage to ultimately be able to confront his fears, and for love of Muriel, his mother figure, and for his own self, overcome his fears, and using his wits and through action as well, get out of a difficult situation. And this, as it turned out, was empowering to a lot of kids. So, look, you don't know. You just don't know. At the time, if you asked me, in 20 years, do you think you'll be talking about this? I wouldn't have known. It was a minor hit at the time. It was, it was enough of a hit at the time, but the cult following now is just tremendous. So I hope I answered your question somewhere in there.
Yes, absolutely, definitely. Yeah. And something else I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is, what's the biggest challenge between writing for that kid age demographic, say 6 to 11, versus writing for preschool age? Because I know you've written plenty of preschool shows too. Yeah.
Well, I like to say that a lot of storytelling skills are fungible. Whether you're writing for little kids or adults, or in between. But a lot of that comes down to who you're working with and, who the executives are. I worked, for instance, on a show called Peg Plus Cat, which was a math curriculum show. A good friend of mine who I met when he wrote a couple of Courage episodes. Billy Aronson created with Jenna Oxley, who's an animator, Billy's a writer, and like a math show for preschoolers No, I don't know. This was a charming show with funny. Peg is like this really antic little kid, and Cat is a very dry kind of. They're a comedy team, you know, and we could write, and they want a lot of songs in it, and that was so much fun because, again, great characters who, when you plug them into situations, you know that the cat is going to be rolling his eyes a lot, and Peg is going to get, really excited about things, and that was as much fun as anything I've written for anybody at any age. I can't say that about every preschool project I've worked on. I give kids a lot of credit for understanding story, and I also think that whatever the curriculum is aside, math, or did a space science show not too long ago, I think that telling a good story well told is really good for the development of the mind of a preschooler. I love doing short form things and, little bits of comedy and sketches and such, but I remember as a kid, like, getting into stories and staying with the story, whether it was a cartoon length or a movie length, and I could almost feel it, like, growing my brain. I wondered when Sesame Street came around, is that gonna, like, in these, like, short bursts of things, it's like, yeah, it appeals to me. I love doing that for what it is, but so in terms of storytelling, I think a lot of the challenges you give yourself to tell a story where the protagonist is challenged and has to overcome, a personal issue or fear or predilection that winds up. I mean, more often than not, I will say, okay, how does the protagonist, how's the hero of the story get us into trouble, and how does this hero get us out of trouble, rather than have the problem dropped on the person and then they have to just dig out from underneath. Certainly there's more room for older kids to get a little fancier. But Arthur's a good example of a show that, to me is kind of a sweet spot in terms of any kid of any age can watch it. A 3-year-old can watch it and get plenty of fun out of it, even if they're not following the story entirely. And parents can enjoy it too. God knows it's the second longest running animated series on television after The Simpsons, and that's really startling for a kids series, because they, like, 5 seasons of a kids series and then you just start it over again because you got a new bunch of kids. So Arthur is really a happy anomaly. So yeah, I mean, I think about the audience, but I'm always writing for myself on some level. I guess I just adjust my age in my head on some unconscious level. I remember what I was laughing at when I was 3. In order to get in touch with my audience, and in order to get in touch with myself and remember who I am, sometimes it's easy to kind of, like, forget who you are as you're going through a career writing so many different shows. It's like, what is my voice? Where do I come from? What thrilled me as a kid? Because the last thing I want to do is become a machine. In a way, you have to be part machine. Like I said, that conveyor belt is there, so you really have to honor it. And sometimes you feel like you're a machine or being run by a machine. But I always want stories to be organic and feel genuine. I don't always succeed, but so that a viewer can have the experience that I hear about courage so much. Yes, I identified with that, and as a child, I remember wanting to fall into the TV. I'd see shows that just made me want to be. I want to be on that show. Every comedy writer of a certain age who grew up with the Dick Van Dyke Show wanted to be Rob Petrie. They wanted to be that guy, and so many of us who grew up in that time point at that as sort of an inspiration. But even in cartoons, there were, as a very young child, I remember, like, these weird cartoons, like, that were either very, very old or were Japanese early anime, style stuff that were just clearly culturally different from what I was used to. But they pulled me in also. And I found myself, like, as a writer, I fall into the story when I'm writing it. When you're writing it, it's, don't you fall into a universe that's, specific to that whatever you're writing. And as a viewer, when I have the same experience, it's really rewarding. And I had that as a kid quite a lot. So, that's it's like everybody into the pool, I guess. That's when I'm writing an episode. Let's all jump into the pool and have a good time. Me writing it, you watching it, everybody performing it, everybody animating it, the music. I just want to be in a high school show for the rest of my life. I want everybody to have a great time, and then I want to go out for ice cream afterwards, and love everybody and just celebrate the great work that we did.
Right.
That's a fabulous feeling.
Nice. What would you say is the biggest difference between writing for live action versus animation?
Well, animation, in large part, I'm talking about the animation I grew up on and children's animation in general. There's a very sort of rhythmic musical sense to it, which I also bring to my live action writing. But cartoons are told so much in the musical score. I mean, you can listen to recordings of cartoons and still sort of see them in your head. And conversely, the experience of seeing a cartoon with a symphony orchestra playing the score live, I don't know if that's conversely exactly, but it's a different kind of experience. It really shows you the marriage of the music, so there's to the image and the movement of the cartoon. It's very much like the difference between writing a cartoon is a lot more like writing a movie in terms of style and the way you tell a story, in terms of action and shots that you have in mind. And a lot of the sitcom writing that I've done for multi-camera shows is much more like writing a stage play. The visuals are important, but you can't do as much with them on a sound stage. And if you try to break free of that, it just doesn't feel like the show sometimes. So one of the differences really then is sort of the feeling of movement, the feeling of the pace at which the story is told, but still it comes down to more similarities than differences. It comes from character, there's enough similarity that, traveling between those two worlds and among several other worlds that I've written in, things feel different, but there's the same basic structure or basic approach, which, as I said, is what can challenge our character and bring out the best experience for the viewer. So those are things you ask yourself whether you're writing an episode of, pick your favorite half-hour primetime comedy if you have one, or Netflix series, or writing. Parker Lewis was a single-camera film show, and that was more like writing a cartoon than writing Alf was. Even though Alf was a puppet, I did do an Alf cartoon, but writing Parker Lewis, in fact, we did a couple of animated moments in it for fun, but part of it is the storytelling itself is very similar in terms of what the characters are going through, but what they're going through in terms of the larger scope of the story is affected sort of by what genre you're working in.
Okay, and also, so I know that you were the executive producer for the Writers Guild Awards in New York for many years. So can you kind of talk about that experience and the importance of the WGA?
It was, I was very involved with the Writers Guild. I was on council for a couple of terms, and I somehow wound up being brought in to write the awards, and then within 2 years I was the executive producer of the Writers Guild Awards in New York. It's not televised, and they hold a ceremony on the West Coast. The Writers Guild East and the Writers Guild West are really two, I think there's sister guilds. When we go on strike together. When we negotiate together. But there are issues between the Writers Guild East and West that sort of throughout the history. The specifics of the relationship are interesting politically and culturally. But just talk about the importance of the Writers Guild. What I don't have in children's animation is the protections that the Writers Guild provide. If I write a Writers Guild covered script, I'm guaranteed, certain kind of credit. They can't mess around with that, they being, whoever I'm doing it for. And I'm guaranteed X dollars, and then whatever the formula is for streaming now. It used to be, for every, like, you'd get paid, then on the first repeat you get paid again. And then I still get checks for pennies for things that I wrote 30 years ago. And health coverage, sometimes it's not enforced, but you can be put through 1 million drafts of something, and the Writers Guild is, strongly opposed to the writer being abused that way. You get 2 drafts and a polish, and beyond that, we have to talk. But you don't have these protections in children's animation, so you have to do it for the love of it and try to get songs in it. Make sure that your name is on the cue sheet so that you get royalties through ASCAP or BMI. Or to all your animation writers out there, who put lyrics into scripts, learn about that stuff. But the awards, saving the more fun thing for a second, the awards were just, it was such hard work. The job that I did is now sort of split among 5 people. So it was a time of transition for the awards. We were taking them out of the ballroom and into a theater. It wasn't broadcast, still not, or streamed, but we wanted the audience to be engaged by this. We really wanted it to be a show. It's writers, and it's one of the greatest aspects of it is that the Writers Guild has news writers and daytime drama, late night, sitcom, some animation. So it's a night when everybody gets together and mingles. So I love that experience. But God, it was a lot of work to do sort of on a volunteer basis. And my 2 favorite award shows were during the year of the strike. The West Coast, well, I was mentioning that the West Coast holds the awards at the same time. Their awards and our awards are identical except for the special awards. So we have our own Lifetime Achievement or Career Achievement Awards. They have their Career Achievement Award, and similar. But as far as the best episode of a sitcom script award, that's both coasts. So there was a time early on when we weren't coordinating that well, and people would be texting to their friends on the West Coast, "We just lost." I won't say who it was who texted it, but on the West Coast, it was Larry David and the table from Curb Your Enthusiasm getting up and leaving like an hour and a half before they were presenting the award. So now we're much better lined up, and I still work on these. I write for them. A friend of mine is Bonnie Dat is the executive producer, and I'm glad, because when you're doing something like that, or you bring somebody in, or several people in, who have the promise of taking over your job, because Chris Albers was the president of the Writers Guild when I started doing this, and he was a writer on Conan. He was the head writer for the monologue, perhaps. So he really had a sense of doing this kind of show, and writing jokes. So he and I really kind of brought it through this evolutionary process to where it is now. So he brought me in and worked me until I was doing it on my own after he didn't run for president again. So then I was left to kind of figure out things like, for instance, we started showing clips from the shows like they do at the Oscars. Oh. Except we're not broadcasting the show. You're dimming the lights in the room, and everybody starts falling asleep. And what really convinced me was I was nominated, it was 2005 or 6, and I was nominated for an episode of Phil of the Future, which my former writing partner was the executive producing on Disney Channel. And I watched this clip of my show, and not one word in it was mine. It had been so rewritten, but in order to get nominated, I submitted my first draft, not their rewrites. And I said, this is silly, because these are writing awards, and
right.
So we cut back. We cut back on that, and we just upped the entertainment value. And it's fun because, last year I got the opportunity to write a bit of comedy for Kenan Thompson cool. with my son Gabe. And growing up, we used to watch Kenan and Kel on Nickelodeon, and we were both fans of his on SNL, and we'd come up with characters for him all the time, and just riff on sketches. My son Gabe is hilarious. And when I saw he was presenting an award, and I'm no longer producing, I just said, dibs on writing his presenter copy. Because presenter copy is generally deadly. I mean, we've all seen award show, and it's like trying to come up with a fresh way to do that. But man, when you're writing for Keenan and you can hear his voice in your head, you can go off on, and he nailed it. He did exactly what we wrote, and he nailed it. And it was just an extraordinary father-son moment for me. Because Gabe was there at the awards with me, and he still doesn't want to like write a pilot with me, but he'll help me next year. It's kind of fun. But the awards, I love the feeling of doing something live. And I was mentioning the strike year, the West had called off their awards. We really didn't know that was happening, but we kept ours anyway. And there were so many West Coast writers in New York striking here because they live here, they work there, so they came back here to strike. And as it turned out, and we were just scaling back, we didn't want to spend a lot of money during a strike, so it was like a pizza party with booze at the Hudson Theater. And as it turned out, that day there was a big meeting where we were being presented with, big membership meeting on both coasts. We were being presented with what we hoped would be the final, yes, strike's over, we've come to terms. So sort of by acclamation, wasn't official, but by acclamation, everyone came from this meeting where they heard and agreed that the strike was resolved. We were going to go back to work. And they came to our awards from that and got really drunk. And Seth Meyers was hosting that year, and it was like I was just running around trying to find Richard Bells or trying to find, we scaled back everything to like the bare bones of a show. And Seth Meyers did a wonderful job just keeping things moving, and by the time we had a mosh pit of drunk writers in the front because we didn't know what to expect, and everybody was celebrating. And I'm very proud that a lot of them went back to California and said, damn, the show in the East is so much cooler, it's so much more interesting and fun. And that was instructional because then I said, okay, we stripped it down to its bare necessities. So when I rebuilt it for the following year, I just added back what was necessary, in my opinion, and it was an even sleeker show. And John Oliver hosted that year, and he fucking killed it. It was just glorious. It was so funny. And the biggest trick to programming a night like that, is to remember, you want to have like halfway through and then, 3/4 of the way through, a high energy comic present an award to get the room to wake up, So often we'd get Gilbert Gottfried out, like in the middle, and then he'd say something that offended everybody, and we'd all wake up, or offended half the room, Let's say generally he doesn't offend everybody at once, but he's so brilliant and really a sweet guy, And it was a fun way to kind of meet people, and in this, I don't mind saying, in this time of the hearings, as we're recording this, I just spent the week watching the impeachment hearings. Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein, who helped bring down the Nixon administration, was presenting an award. And I'm not going to write jokes for him. He's a journalist. So I listened to a couple of speeches of his, and this is it's how I would approach writing a character on a TV show. I listened to a couple of speeches, and I had his voice in my head, and I wrote a little bit of presenter copy. He was presenting a news award, and it was dry, but it wasn't dry. It wasn't funny, but it was a bit flowery. It wasn't dry. And I went up to him afterwards, and I said, I wrote your copy. I wasn't like bragging. I was complimenting him because I said, you nailed it. You owned it. It's like sometimes I write funny stuff for people who are funny, and they just don't own it, and this was great, thank you. And he said, it sounded like I wrote it, and that's always a great compliment from anybody. He said, it just sounded like my voice. I said, well, I listened to a couple of your speeches. There's something I never would have done, and it was a little, it was 3 or 4 sentences, but I got a little cred from the man who helped bring down Nixon. Can't put that quite on a resume, but I can say I worked with Carl Bernstein for 10 minutes. So, it's fun. It's a weird experience, and it's very it's a very loose, it's a well-structured evening still. But I mean, I'm glad that Bonnie, is I think she kept a lot of the best that I brought to it and Chris Albers brought to it when we were sort of changing it up, and sort of made it her own, but it's still got energy and it still moves, and it is like a story, and the evening has an arc to it, and it's not a story per se, but emotionally you want the audience to feel like this rising energy, not this depletion of energy that most award shows provide, and it helps to not be on TV. Because you could say anything, and we've had some really the best moments were ones that were unscripted, where somebody just goes nuts on stage and just decides to talk for 20 minutes, and blow the schedule, but it winds up on YouTube because it's somebody interesting going a little wild after having too many drinks. A lot of fun, and even wrote some musical numbers for Ed. Jimmy Fallon doing his Jim Morrison imitation. Was trying to come up. I was no longer the executive producer. My friend John Marshall was the executive producer that year, and we were trying to come up with something funny for Fallon to do. I was on hold with John on the phone at 1 a.m, and I sat down at the piano, and The Doors, Complete, was the music book in front of me. So while on hold with John, thinking about what we could do with Fallon musically, I started playing Riders on the Storm, which you might not be familiar with, but it was a big hit for The Doors. I start playing, there's a riff, the bass riff that sort of starts the song, and I start singing Writers Guild Awards. And I said, okay, that's it. And John gets back on the phone and says, so did you solve it? I said, yeah, actually I did. And I just sang Writers Guild Awards. He said, good, let's do that. Nice. And I wrote a version of that for Fallon to do. They rewrote it mostly, the Fallon people, but fine, it was still my idea. So, it's a place where I sort of get to do my smaller form stuff, short jokes and sketches maybe, or songs, and it's fun, and it's a really good evening. It's got a lot of good energy to it, and it's become a hot ticket. In New York, it's always over full. Yeah, and the fact that I'm still involved in it is startling to me. So, I don't even know who the host is yet for this year. It's always in February. And they usually start, by now they must be locking it into it. I haven't asked Bonnie yet about what's going on.
So that goes into another question I have, just favorite songs that you've written.
Well, not that my songs are well known enough for me to, point at this one or the other one, but there's a song that Jody Gray from Courage and I wrote. He was doing the score for Clifford the Big Red Dog movie, and they needed songs, some sung by characters and some just on the soundtrack. So Jody called me in to write the songs with him. And one thing I noticed about the movie, with all due respect to everyone involved, there was no tension. It was really like they did not want a 3 or 4-year-old watching this to get frightened. That Clifford overhears the dad, Emily Elizabeth's dad, saying, he's eating us out of house and home. And then Clifford decides he's going to enter a contest, a talent contest, and the prize is a life supply of dog food, and he runs away. But the thing is, he's coming back. There's never he's just going to come back with or without the dog food, and the family loves him, and the complaint he overheard was amplified in his head, in his big red head. And so they wanted a song for when he leaves. I'm thinking, like, geez, he's leaving, but he's coming back. And so that reminded me of when my kids were young, and we had moved back to New York from L.A., and I'd be traveling to L.A. on business, because there's nothing that gets you hotter in L.A. than moving back to New York. Nothing gets you hotter in New York than moving to L.A. You learn this. At least then. So I was doing a lot of traveling, and my kids were, 3 and 6, 3 and 7. And I thought, if I had the wisdom that I'm allowed to have now, sitting down trying to write a song, that's kind of the same thing. I'm going away, they're very sad, but I'm coming back. I said, what should I have said to them that would have been pithy and a good song title? I can't come home until I go. So we wrote the song, and it was sort of a Beatle-y kind of Harry Nilsson, if that means anything to you. It should actually. There's a new Harry Nilsson album out. He's been dead for a long time, but sadly, but brilliant performer, and also did some animation stuff. Wrote and wrote songs for animation. So this song had this like pop hit quality about it, but it was this yin and yang song, yin and yang thing. Sun only rises from a dark, dark sky. Answers only come to satisfy why. And this goodbye comes back hello. I can't come home until I go. And it's really beautiful. Jody produced the record, produced this track, and it was gorgeous. It was as good as so many pop records I've ever heard. And we got people contacting us who were using that song particularly, for their music therapy or the music therapy of someone they were caring for. In one case, most notably, and this is just the best example, here's a woman who has like a 3-year-old daughter, 4-year-old daughter, and the woman's father, who was the patriarch of the family, had suffered a brain injury in an accident. And part of his therapy was listening to music, and music therapy is something I'm totally interested in and might have gone into if I pursued that track with psychology, and might still, who knows. So the little girl's grandfather hears his granddaughter in the next room watching the end of the Clifford movie, and then Till I Go comes on, the closing credits, and so Grandpa brightens, and his daughter, the mom, notices this, makes the connection. That song, he wants that song. And Warner Brothers and Scholastic never released these songs as in any downloadable or CD, fashion. So they would contact Jody if somebody wanted a copy of it, or where can I get it? And that's how we found out about this. And that song in particular, there was, when I say many, it was like, 5 or 6 emails from people who were using it. My kid with autism, not me, but, loves this song. And it's the yin and yang kind of like, things seem bad, but things will change and get brighter. Yes, it's a little bit, sometimes things don't get brighter. But for the purposes of the story and the purposes of the song and the purposes of the music therapy for these people, it's what was needed. In fact, in the New York Times review, as I recall, I think it was A.O. Scott, one of their fine movie reviewers, pointed out that the film really didn't have any conflict. But there's a really nice song in it that kind of points to that fact, but creates the illusion of tension. And it's, thank you, he noticed. I'm probably over remembering it, but he noted it, and it made me feel good. But that song stands out because it was so well received and touched so many people, and when I say so many, it's like I said, we only found out about a handful, but it had to have been wider than that, if that was the sample that we got. And it was a really good song. And I wrote a song recently that I performed live once about how to write a cartoon. It's kind of one of my most recent ones, but it's really an ode to putting things off. It's interesting. And I'll get to it tomorrow, kind of thing. That so many writers go through, and everybody goes through. But that's Until I Go stands out. I mean, there are a lot of songs that look early on in my career. Like I would write songs for sitcoms. Like I was in a sitcom that co-starred Elaine Stritch, who was a great lady of the stage. She passed away a couple of years back, but she was a Stephen Sondheim goddess, and she had a brusque voice, and she sang famously a song called Ladies Who Lunch, and she was on 30 Rock. She played Baldwin's mom, I believe, on the show. But I got to write songs for her because the show I was working on didn't want to pay licensing for established songs, so I wrote a couple of songs that she got to sing, and whatever song of mine Elaine Stritch sings or sang is my favorite song at that moment. So I've actually gotten the opportunity to do things that startled me, like with songs, it's like, wow. And sometimes I'd find out, like on a cartoon, Jody and I did an album of other Clifford songs. We wrote a whole album of other, not from the soundtrack. And after David Bowie died, Jody said, "Did you know that the guy who plays saxophone on What Dogs Like, which was this crazy song we wrote that Kel Mitchell, the other half of Keenan and Kel, performed because he was T-Bone on Clifford. And it was this wild jazz song, and there was this crazy sax break on it. It was like totally lunatic, brilliant sax break. Just took the song out into space and then landed it again. And it was McCaslin, his last name. I'm blanking on his first name. But he was Bowie's sax player and actually went out, after Bowie died, went out on tour on the Let's Honor David Bowie tour, honoring his music. So he's like, what, are you kidding? Bowie's sax player was all over that song? Because in the world of musicians, musicians are the coolest. Rock stars, I'm talking about the people whose job it is to be consummate musicians, far better than I am, and just... We talk about writers wrapping themselves around an existing project. Musician has to come in and give himself to a song or herself to a song. And I've just been startled, to realize who has played on these tracks that, for the most part, Jody has produced. After the fact, like, oh my God, that running into a drummer. I went to see Glenn Campbell and Jimmy Webb, fine songwriter who wrote a lot of Glenn Campbell's hits, performed some years ago before Glenn Campbell got sick, and these are like two of the biggest names in music from my youth and onward. And the drummer looked familiar, and I realized, oh, he's the guy who was in the basement in New Jersey with Jody and me recording that song for something that we were doing at the time, and there he is on stage in the Carlisle Hotel playing with two of the biggest figures in the music business, in the history of contemporary music. Whether you know them or not, it's true. And, he did that gig for a couple of hundred. He did that gig for a couple of thousand. They're working musicians. So that's another upside to doing music, is you really get to work with some cool cats. And I don't mind saying cats because that's musician speak for cat. So, yeah, I love songwriting. And I do have a lot of other favorites, but that's... Until I Go, as I was mentioning, just stands out in my mind because of the effect it seemed to have on
Nice, that's wonderful.
Sorry that my answers are so long.
No, I love hearing all these stories. It's awesome.
You're easy to talk to.
Thank you. So I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on, just shifting gears a little bit, on like nostalgia culture and how so many shows, movies, etc. are being rebooted, remade. Just kind of like, I'm curious to hear your take on all of that.
There's an inescapable truth in entertainment, and my old friend Bill used to put it this way: they sooner option a matchbook than your pitch because the matchbook's been published. And there's some comfort in rebooting something that has proven itself successful. And when you're an executive putting millions of dollars on the line, as well as your career, the safe thing to do is say no to everything. But there are some reboots that are really good and some that just like, why? My preference is, if there's something that I cherished, I feel very protective of it. When I heard about the Dr. Seuss series, it's not a reboot per se, but it's writing more Dr. Seuss stories. When I heard about that series before I was even approached, I thought, oh, for goodness sake, the doctor is dead. He wrote 50 books. He's had a couple of cartoons done. Leave it alone. Right. And I got the call that they wanted to meet with me, and I thought, maybe it's not such a bad idea. And I got the job, and I thought it was a wonderful idea. But culturally, the endless reimagining of Spider-Man gives rise to some interesting projects along the way. I really enjoy a lot of, but I like a reboot when it honors the original and takes it further. But what I prefer to do is take what made that thing so special and bring that to another project. So it's like, from the people who brought Courage the Cowardly Dog, here's the next thing, and the DNA is still there. You could still feel it. Some of these reboots and sequels and reimaginings are great. I mean, I think Freaky Fred Reanimated is in a category by itself, but it's fine if it works. But the reason it happens, I think, is a bad one, which is people are afraid to take chances with a lot of money, which is wise, but they have to understand, it's easy to reject something new, as they said. It's sort of the safe thing to do. And that's why, even pitches for new projects are often told in terms of existing things. It's Scooby-Doo meets 30 Rock. And that kind of thing. I don't know what that would be, but now I feel like I ought to write it.
That sounds intriguing.
Yeah. I was just picturing Tina Fey, who also hosted the awards.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh, she was great. Anyway, I consider myself so lucky. I just take a pause here to say, to have worked with so many brilliant people in all aspects of productions and different kinds of productions. People who are personal heroes of mine, people who I just it's like, here's somebody who I never heard, but oh my God, brilliance, and feeling like I plugged myself into a life I imagined as a child. I got an email recently from my former partner, Roger, commenting about how I used to stop. Like, we'd be walking from one meeting to another on a lot. We were in our 20s and we were hot and making money. And I would stop and I would say, look where we are. Look what we're doing. Oh my God. Just take... And he started calling me Mr. Perspective.
Oh.
And he wrote me an email saying, so that was, I might have poo-pooed it at the time, but it was pretty wise. It was pretty like in the moment kind of thing. It was just the sweetest letter, and just like basically saying like, those were golden moments, and stopping to appreciate them. It's another thing about a writer's life, and I know I'm just going off on a tangent here, but I live on tangents, so you get to really travel among worlds and do a lot of amazing things, and it's like but when you're writing a script, that finished project, you need to stop for a moment. When you finish a script, when you finish something, before you hand it in, I'm talking about something you're hired to do. It's certainly true for anything you're doing on spec, on your blog, in your head, in your journal. But when you're doing a script, particularly, and you're about to hand it in, you're going to get notes. It might get rewritten by somebody else. Take that moment, look at the thing that you did, and appreciate it as a thing unto itself, a work that you'd be proud to show somebody in script form. It's another thing about writing animation is I love writing scripts that make you feel like you've seen the cartoon. Not over-directed, but just with enough information that you get the rhythm of it. So it's just, I always like to take a breath, before I send something in at 11:59 when it's due at midnight, or 11:59 the morning after it was due at midnight, with an apology. But just to say, wow, this is really good. I might or might not feel it's perfect, but it's pristine. It's the best I can do, and it's going to change after this. It's almost like sending your kid to college and just appreciate before they go out the door. Yeah, we made it through the teenage years, and then I don't know how you're going to come back from school, but you send it out in the world and it gets changed. So you appreciate your work, and as a writer, if you're doing scripts, you're doing something that is a template or a map, or call it what you will, or scripture for a production of some sort. But I like the scripts to be things unto themselves, something that you'd enjoy reading, and something that's worth a moment. That's why I like the Writers Guild Awards also, because we're celebrating writing exclusively, through the night. Although there are awards for news artists, graphic artists, because we cover them also. So it does spill over into other areas too. But it's important to realize that even though most people don't see those scripts, they're finished products in and of themselves. At least as far as you're concerned, as far as I'm concerned. When you write something, it's complete, and then you send it out. As soon as you send it out, it's not complete anymore. It's starting a new life, and you have to ride with that. See where it's going. I don't even recall the original question, because I just that thought that writing is a thing to enjoy.
Yeah.
Or to enjoy having done. And then as soon as you send it out, anxiety sets in. because then you get the notes, and sometimes the notes are like, notes from party A, party B, party C, party D, and they're being given to you by a head writer, somebody who hasn't really synthesized them into one cogent set of directives, and you say, well, this note and this note are in direct opposition. If I do this, it's the opposite. So you have to like be able to like press somebody into committing to, like, because I can't figure it out. I don't want to be the one. You're the head writer on this one. Help me figure it out. Head writers have different styles, and just simply being a conduit for notes that are unprocessed is not a good way to go. Synthesizing the notes and giving coherent guidance to a writer with an understanding of why they're being given these notes is it's important. I can do that when they're my notes. Sometimes if I'm passing on notes that came from above me, I'll have to say, I don't get it either, honestly, but let's make it work. Let's surprise ourselves and make this note or this note giver a genius by coming up with something that's brilliant. And that goes back to, my feeling when Roger and I would feel strongly about, I say we should do this here, and he says we should do that here, and we both know we're right. We abandon those two things and we come up with a third thing that's better than those two things. Let's put our heads together and we'll put those aside. Maybe we'll go back to one of them, after we spend 3 hours on this and get nowhere. But, coming up with answers to problems is fun. If the problems aren't sort of man-made, it's like you're doing this for the wrong reasons. But I remember, I walked into the Seuss offices one day, and the first thing I heard was, we're 45 seconds short. We need 45 seconds, and we don't have it. And I thought, oh shit, okay, all right, do we have any telephones, and can we put together a bank of puppets as though they're answering phones, and we could do a phone bank, and yeah, okay, you assemble that, I'll go write it. I love that kind of crisis. I love that kind of moment where it's like, we got to come up with something. We got to put our heads together. It's when I'm calm that I get most anxious. So.
Okay, so then just another question I have for you is, can you share any details about any current projects you're working on?
Well, I'll tell you, I won't tell you the specifics, but
okay.
This is what I'm working on at the moment, because it's the end of the year, and there's not, the business goes to sleep around this time. Just in terms of getting meetings and such. I've gotten jobs at the end of November where I've worked through Christmas and New Year's. But when Freaky Fred Reanimated hit YouTube, and suddenly, now it's nearly at 2.5 million views, but in the first week or two, it was just growing. Oh my God, 1 million views! I've never had, anything like this. It's been associated with anything like this. And I have a YouTube channel, and I put channel in quotes because I have one video on it, and it's a video, it's a song I wrote with Jody, and I did a video for it, and it was for the midterm elections to get out the vote. And I'm a liberal, so I'm getting out the blue vote. And that's the only thing that's on my YouTube channel. And suddenly, I go from 0 subscribers to 1,200 virtually overnight. And some of them are watching this video. One of them took a very right-wing approach. I won't even say what he said to me. But he just went off on a tear, and I took away the comment. I wrote, look, I wasn't expecting all you people to show up, but I want to put something here that you'll enjoy. So it sparked me. I wanted to get it up for Halloween, and there was no way that was going to happen. But what I'm working on, it's a story song, and I'm writing it for, I hesitate to say my fans, but, the fans of Courage who came to my website, and okay, my fans. It's as a writer, it's kind of hard to earn even that kind of, hard to own even that and earn that kind of celebrity. But with social media, apparently, it can happen a lot easier. And that's how you and I got to talking.
Yeah.
But now it's gone from being just a song that I want to do a simple video for to actually inspiring an entire story that I don't know yet. Is it something for the stage? Is it an animated feature? Is it a limited run series? And it's a pretty dark song. I wanted it to be funnier, but it really got into sort of Tom Waits territory, if you're familiar with Tom Waits. But sort of it's funny, but in a way that, you'd laugh a little at the beginning, and then you'd be going, ooh, it's a retelling of a tale that we've heard many times, but is much closer to the original version, which is always more adult and bloodier and more horrific than the Disney version, just in broad terms. So happily at the moment, I'm not going crazy looking, trying to get something done for money. I'm instead working on something that I'm just going to put up on my YouTube channel, show to these people who showed up for something interesting. I should put up something really funny first, though, because because this song might make people feel bleak, but it's great, and it's just nice to do something that's sort of like, I've done things that I've put up on Facebook or the internet or whatever before, and gotten lots of likes and hey, really great, whatever. But I feel like, all right, there's a theater full of people waiting for this. It's 1,200, 1,500 subscribers now. So it's the nature of the project that really is making me happy. And the hope that it'll be so good that it will find its way, whether, going viral is one thing, but I mean, I want it to be proof of concept for a larger project. I want it to be, and it's something that the larger project is something that I've been developing for many years in my head, and it's just a storytelling format, let's say, that involves a lot of different media, and it's sort of complicated, but it's in an anthology, so this story would fit well into that mold. So it could be that, it could be a movie, or it could just be this one little song and video. But I'm really eager to see what happens when, the fans see it, and, if that will help move it out there into the world. I mean, we live in a time now, when you start any sentence with "we live in a time," it's either a movie trailer or, a boring thought is about to appear. We live in a time when, you can publish yourself, as you know, and you have a handful of fans. Like, I'm your fan. Yeah, I heard I saw your tweet, and I said, about Freaky Fred Reanimated and a little interaction you did. So I said, I'm going to listen to a podcast.
About
and
courage.
I was,
yeah,
and about courage. And I was just thoroughly charmed by hearing you speak by yourself and ruminate on your experiences watching the show.
Yeah.
It gave me so much, and I really sort of enjoyed your very casual style, and your memories of watching it became vivid to me in the way you were describing them. So I truly say, great work, and someone you're a fan of can become your fan out there. Yeah. It can happen. So we'll see. I mean, it's nice to write something for pure reasons. I did it more when I was younger. And I really just started getting back into songwriting again for my own pleasure. And this was part of that process. So Jody and I are working on it, and we're trying to figure out what kind of video it'll be, and you'll be the first to know.
Nice. Sounds very cool. Very, very cool. So my last question for you is, what advice do you have for aspiring TV writers?
Well, first I'll say what Steve Martin says when interviewed about it. This is, be so good they can't ignore you. Whatever it is you do, one's version of being so good might not be somebody else's. And there are a lot of people out there who think they're going to be great, and they just aren't. And there are a lot of people out there who can be. But, really, lead with your best work. But before that, one of the best things that ever happened to me as a writer was Roger. College friend, simpatico, our senses of humor drew us to each other. He's also very musical, so we had this wonderful partnership, and people would always ask us, well, which one of you is the funny one and which one's good with character? And it was never like that. We both could do it all, but we just like doing it together. If you can get a partner when you're starting out, and it's the right partner, because it's like dating, it's like falling in love, and you're creating things together. It's a very intimate experience if you're doing it right, and creatively intimate. And I still have Roger's voice in my head as an editor. I'm a much better writer for having worked with this brilliant friend of mine. And it helped us navigate all the exigencies of the beginning of a career. And his his contacting me about being Mr. Perspective after all these years is kind of funny, for all my memories of it is just how, I think back on it and think, how would it have been if I had been alone doing this? It would have been half as much fun and twice as much misery. Because when you got a partner, when shit goes wrong, as it often does, you can shut the door and you have each other. And when shit goes right, you got someone to hug and jump up and down. It's like I said before, I want to be out with my high school friends celebrating our production of Guys and Dolls, every night. That's what I want. When we would do sitcoms and after a Friday night taping of a show, going out with the group to celebrate, if you had any energy left after a week, depending on the show. Some shows are chaos and you're toast by the end of the week. Some shows run well, and the ones that run well, you get to go out and celebrate, And that was always a great feeling, like a new play every week. So celebrating that is important, and it helps to do it. So, but to do it with a partner. But having a partner makes you a better writer, and challenging each other, knowing that you're, and it helps keep you honest too. It helps keep you writing. I'm not just beholden to myself and the show. I'm beholden to my partner to do my half of it. At the beginning, we would write everything together, and then as we proceeded, we would split up the tasks and then merge them. Also, I would say to someone starting out, in terms of trying to break in, the thing that you show yourself with, the script you send in, what that is changes. It's like when I was starting out, they wanted to see spec episodes of shows that existed. So you'd write a Seinfeld, you'd write a meta, but you wouldn't write it for the show that you wanted a job on. And now they look more at pilots in your own voice. But it was really good exercise to try to write in the voices of shows and characters that existed. Develop your ear. There's music to this, and I think part of what made Roger and me such a great team was our musicality. And we heard, both of us, we would hear the voices of our characters. I remember coming up with, even before, for that first script, before we knew who'd play the part, we were trying to, and this is a good little trick for, it's not going to get you into the business, but it'll help your writing. We needed a character quirk, of a vocal tick that would define the character. And it was somebody who was, trying to get somebody all jazzed up about an idea. And we thought back to somebody we knew in college whose verbal tick was, he would interrupt himself. No. He would interrupt himself. No. He would interrupt. So he would just stop himself with the word no.
Wow.
And then he would make the thing bigger. It's like, you did a good job on... No. You did a great job on... No. Nobody did a better job than you. So that, when, story elements aside, try to hear your characters in your head. It's easier when it's an existing show, live action or animated. But think of people who have interesting speech patterns and verbal tics. And we both knew this guy from college who... No. We knew him from college. And it's like, you could even say that till it doesn't make sense anymore, And we put it into the script, and damn, it was performed by an actor, Sandy Barron's gone, a comedian, and he nailed it. He nailed it, and it's like, wow, we put it on the page, and it was so, without any direction from us, in parentheses or in person, that little, use of dashes and ellipses, no. That brilliant use of dashes, no. That well-studied use, he got, and it just taught us right away that people have interesting voices and voice patterns, and it is kind of like writing a song. And I even hear it myself right now, after having watched so much MSNBC lately, I feel like I'm falling into the speech patterns of Ari Melber right now, if you know who that is. Anybody out there who knows who Ari Melber is would hear how this might be Ari Melber's cadence. Or I'm delusional and it's not. And I think it is just entirely possible. And, the question what people often ask, how do I get representation? It's a question a lot of people are asking right now, established writers. Do the work first. We got good representation when we got ourselves a job. I mean, Roger met Steve Martin doing an interview with him, and we got that gig. We didn't even have to write a spec script to get into the business. The first spec script I wrote was when I moved back from LA, and Roger and I split up as a team, and I needed something that just had my name on it. So I wrote an episode of Mad About You. And that got me, I remember I remember saying to our manager when he said, "Wow, this is really good." And I said, "You sound a little too surprised, Erwin. Did you think it was going to be bad?" He said, "Well, you never know what you're going to get when a team splits up." Well, thanks for the confidence then. But I'm glad you like it. So depending upon what kind of show you want to write, I mean, just it's very easy to say keep writing. It's not easy to do. But to try exercises to write in the voices of characters that exist and characters that don't yet exist. And people say, write what you know. I believe in writing what you know, but what you know can apply to things you don't know. So, I've worked on projects like all manner of creature and cartoon and different cultures on TV. I was fortunate enough to work on Living Single, and it was wonderful to actually be in a room in the 90s that was as diverse as any writer's room I would hope to be in. I, as a white Jewish guy from Brooklyn, was in the minority for a change, and I don't even think we had anybody from Harvard around the table, from the Lampoon. It was like a United Nations of skin tones and experiences, and I was flattered to have been included in that. So it's wonderful to take yourself to places that you haven't been. Another thing that I did in trying to write movies, which were so much bigger, like I remember when I started to be able to get a whole sitcom in my head at once. For a while it felt so unwieldy, like 24 minutes, But then when I was writing a movie, trying my hand at it the first time, I took the movie Big, which I always loved. Tom Hanks, it's just beautiful textbook screenplay in so many ways. And I broke it down. I worked it backwards into outline, and then I took the outline and I worked out the broad strokes. Like, okay, here's where the character. It's almost like so many books on screenwriting theory that you'd read, but here's where the character first confronts an obstacle. And in other words, I then diagrammed the moves so that I understood the flow without the specific plot. And it might sound mechanical, but it was at first. But in order to start feeling how this thing really worked, I then retrofitted a plot into that general flow. And it helped me so much, and then it started to become more organic. So I think it's helpful to backwards engineer whatever it is you love watching, whatever you emulate, whether it's an 11-minute cartoon or a feature or an opera, and break it down into its elements and understand what went into that. To understand how this thing works. You take apart the machine, because you're going to have to put one together. And you're not going to know how to do that just from looking at it from the outside. It's a tool, and just, keep at it. I mean, the good thing about writing is, like, if you're an actor, you're not going to just stay up all night acting, in your office. You might be running lines if you're doing something, yes. But I can write something that is just something I want to write. And I could do it in the absence of production. So, keep writing and appreciate what you learn how to enjoy it also, and learn how to live with the abject misery that is the blank screen or blank page. That white light staring back at you, mocking you for having turned on the machine in the first place.
Oh, God.
Which is why outlining something is always good. It's effort. If you have the talent, whenever I teach a class or do a seminar, I know nothing I say is going to make your career. Nothing I say is going to break your career. Those of you who will succeed are going to succeed with or without me, and the rest of you aren't. I don't say this out loud, but I try to offer things that will help those who will succeed and maybe make those who ought to be doing something else realize they ought to be doing something else. And don't be downhearted. This is something that can stop a career cold, even if you're brilliant, is rejection. And so the last thing I'll say about that is don't despair because what you've written isn't being celebrated yet, or isn't being, it might take 5 years for that executive who had it in his drawer or her drawer to say, oh, this is the thing that I read 5 years ago, and now Spielberg wants to have the movie rewritten. Here's the perfect writer for it. Likely not Spielberg, but in my case, yeah. And I can remember recently, but I can remember how much it hurt to be rejected, not to get a job on Letterman after I thought he'd hired me. I had a meeting with him, and he said, "When can you start?" I thought that meant you're hired. So it was Thursday, and I said Monday, and he said, "Okay, great." So all day Friday, I'm like, I'm working for Letterman on Monday. and then I get a call from the agent who I just had snagged to send in this material, and he said, yeah, they're going in a different direction. And it wasn't until years later that I spoke to someone who was directly involved with that moment and got some insight into what was Dave's brain at the time, and that it sounds like something that would have happened where he thought he made a decision, but then he decided not to make a decision. It was a time of some kind of upheaval. I don't know. So you gain perspective later on in interesting ways. But I remember the best rejection that we ever got, which only made us stronger. Lorne Michaels did a show, a primetime hour-long show, like Saturday Night Live. This was in the mid-'80s, called The New Show. 10 o'clock. I forget if it was live or not, but it was similar in style to SNL. So Roger and I submitted material. This is before or just after our career was taking off, I forget, but we submitted material through some channel. The show was on the air, the show was canceled. 9 months later, the show's been off the air for 9 months. I don't even remember what we sent into the show. We get a letter in the mail, and it's a form letter. Apparently what they had was they had 3 form letters that went out. And essentially, it's like, you submitted material to the show, and it took us a while to get to it, but we wanted you to know that we read it. And the first level of email was, had the show gone further, you would have been a prime candidate for a gig on the show. So keep at it. Second level was, we wanted you to know that we read your material, and while it wasn't quite ready for prime time, it wasn't quite ready, you have something there. So keep at it. The third level down was the one we got. We didn't want you to think we didn't read your material. We did, and we just want to let you know that a different line of work would be recommended.
Oh my God.
Maybe it wasn't as blunt as that, but it's like a lot of people think they can do this stuff, and we understand it. I do remember who signed the letter. I don't even want to say it. Because it was from somebody whose work I knew and admired. I knew that, and we just, I laughed because, first of all, they had to wait 9 months after their own show was canceled to send an email, to send a letter. This was actually before email was popular, or existed really, I guess, and send this thing that was clearly a form letter, and we didn't know till later there were 3 form letters, so we talked to other writers who had submitted, and having a partner made it easier to take, and it was so ridiculous, it didn't get me downhearted. It made me laugh, unlike Letterman not hiring me, which made me cry for 6 months and not watch the show, because I thought, I'll never do anything in this business again, But that smackdown from that writer on the New Show was just such a funny rejection. It kind of put other rejections in context for me, because you're going to get more rejections than you're going to get, acceptance. So keep going until, if somebody you really trust suggests a different line of work, maybe you should consider it. But if you've got a gift for writing and you've got a passion for writing, find ways to make yourself happy about it at the beginning of your career and during your career and late in your career, because in success, it's going to become arduous, it's going to become a task, you're going to end up hating writing, you're going to wish you never got into this business because you've been up for 6 days and you haven't slept, and you're nowhere closer to getting this thing to where they want it. You have to come to terms with the twists and the tangles of rejection and of ill-advised notes and all of that, and also pick out the people you trust, pick out the people you feel can read your material and give you good feedback. That's why having a partner was so good. We did that a little bit, but we didn't have to do it. If I had been on my own, I'd have shown my stuff to more people for feedback. But the people to whom you should show your work for input, it's rare. Those people are rare. So you have to choose wisely. It's important to take a step back from everything and find a way to make yourself feel good about it again. And social media is a nice way to, like, okay, I thought of something funny, I tweeted, oh look, it got retweeted by Neil Gaiman, and now 1 million people are saying, okay, or 3 of my friends liked it, or you liked it, and like, oh, that's swell. So you get a little bit of your, jollies that way, and then you get back to the grind. And I go on Facebook and I see what all my friends are doing. I get jealous. Meanwhile they're getting jealous of me because everything's an illusion and nobody ever wants to look like they're unemployed. So, and the last piece of advice is kind of something I said already that I would give to somebody starting out is enjoy it, and do be Mr. or Ms. or Mrs. or however you identify perspective. Be my Mr. Perspective, as Roger called me. Stop and appreciate the moments that you're going through, because what you think now is a failure is actually potentially a success in a year, in a minute, 10 years later. You really don't know. And so you've got to listen to people, and then you've got to not listen to people. And you just got to figure out what to listen to and what not. It's easy to listen to praise, and it's hard to listen to critique.
True, yeah.
But the important thing is who's praising you and who's critiquing you. That person should be someone you respect and has a rare combination of skills, understanding what it is to write, but also the ability to look at something that exists and see what's right with it and what's wrong with it, and then communicate that to you. That's a skill I developed over the course of years, going from my first writing job to becoming a showrunner and a head writer and an executive producer. The ability to communicate well my thoughts on somebody's work, it's a hard thing to find. And often I, felt like this should be like school, right? I mean, my teachers knew my work was good and I get an A. Why don't I get an A? So it's instead I'm getting like a C plus and sorry. And often you'll be told how wonderful you are and you won't get the job. There are very few bad meetings in Hollywood. Everybody, likes to leave with a smile. It's something to get used to. But you have to believe in yourself. That sounds so corny and trite, but you need some resource within yourself to push yourself forward when things aren't perfect or anywhere near perfect. And that'll happen at the beginning, in the middle, and later on in your career. I always feel like I'm starting my career again. Whether it's a time of plenty and I'm going through, I have a choice of jobs, or a time when it's like, shit, am I ever going to work again? Because that'll happen. And I have to find the resource within myself to keep going. And not to get bitter when I turn on the TV and see shows that I like, that friends of mine are working on. But I'll go back to what Steve said. Just be so good they can't ignore you, and everything that implies, which is a lot of hard work to get there. Really think of it as practicing an instrument, a musical instrument, and what it takes to learn the piano, and how you have to really practice something over and over and over again to be able to do it as a career. If you break out in your own voice as a novelist or screenwriter, and like, okay, hooray. But if you're a journey person through cartoons or primetime, whatever, television, you have to learn to bend yourself and be flexible and go with the flow. So, just basically a good idea is to ask somebody to punch you in the face repeatedly and just tell them you're going to try better next time. And, I can fix this face now that it's all bloody.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what it feels. It feels like sometimes. But there's plenty to celebrate. I just saw a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the Mr. Rogers movie. So, what do you do with the mad that you feel? What do you do? Well, you're a writer. When I was so angry at a note that I got that was particularly vile and grotesquely expressed, and I was so angry about it, I sat down, and rather than just, as Mr. Rogers suggested, bang the low notes on the piano repeatedly, I sat down and wrote a little 30-second musical invention. Look, not everybody can do that, but it was something I enjoyed doing. This is something I wouldn't have done had I not gotten this bad note that's making me so angry. So instead of spiraling and ruining the ski trip I was on with my family, and I don't ski, so it was just me sitting in a room, and I could easily spiral. I just had this little music keyboard with me, and I wrote this little 30-second piece that had nothing to do directly with the bad note that I had just gotten, but was my way of saying, okay, I just got a disappointment of some sort, and it hurts. And rather than suffer, I'm going to create something to remind myself that I'm good at it, and it's good. And now every time I play this 30-second piece, I'm grateful for that grotesque note. And I do mean it when I say grotesque. It was an actionable note. It was practically harassment. I'll leave it at that. But maintain your joy if you can, doing what you do at the beginning, middle, and the career never ends, as far as I'm concerned. Because, sometimes I'll sit here going, yeah, I guess I'm done. And then I know I'm not, but that's just because I'm in a moment of misery, which is always better when you've got a partner. But anyway, I hope this has been a wonderful conversation. Is there anything else?
Yes, so insightful. I really appreciate all of this. I love hearing all your stories. It's been amazing. So also
I know this is much longer than you anticipated.
I love it though. Yeah. Just also let everyone know about your social media, where they can find you on social media.
Oh, sure. Yes, please. Please join my massive 1,200 or so followers, subscribers on YouTube, which I think is just David Cohen, but mostly I use all three names. On Twitter, Cohen DS, Cohen DS on Twitter. Facebook, David Stephen Cohen. Instagram, I think is D Stephen Cohen. But so that's pretty much where you can find me, and I'm trying to figure out a way to get out of Facebook, but it's really hard. It's like I've devoted so much of my life to it. My favorite joke I ever wrote is on Facebook. It's a very, very long joke. You look it up. It's one of the only notes I have in Facebook. But when I realized that Bob Newhart and Freddie Mercury shared a birthday, I had to write a joke that involved the two of them. And if you know who Bob Newhart is, he's still alive.
Course, yeah.
And Freddie Mercury, of course. So it was Freddie Mercury and Bob Newhart walk into a bar, and then it's the lyrics to Bohemian Rhapsody played out, it's just. So there'd be no other place for that, than I would imagine than social media. So go to my Facebook page, read that joke, and then that's fine. If nobody out there does anything else, and I'll try to get something interesting up on YouTube for anybody who's interested, and I hope you all will like it. And it's really a pleasure to reach a point where you can talk to people who appreciate your work and whose work you appreciate. So this is a gift to me, and I thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it.
I appreciate you, and I like your Paramount Pictures shirt.
Thank you. Okay, and with that is going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, $1.87. I'll be discussing The Gift of the Magi. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.